Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be looking at games 11 through 15 from the Encyclopedia of Chess Miniatures. As always, I've keyed in the games, but I have not performed my own analysis until we see them together. So you'll notice I keep the evaluation meter up, so it gives us a general idea of where the pivotal moments are in the game, and we can do the analysis together and figure out what went right and what went wrong. So, quick note, this particular match took place in 2003, and I'm mentioning the details because it took place between a couple pretty high rated players. One really high rated, Londa, 2649, plays white, and Nedkov plays black with a 2149 rating. So it's good to know that because it helps us realize that these types of mistakes do take place at high level play. So I'm going to just step through the first few moves here till we get to a key moment. One thing I'll notice right here is that this strikes me as a hyper-modern opening situation. And by hyper-modern, for those less familiar, it typically is a reference to the way black plays the opening, where they play a little bit passively, where they let white take control of the center of the board with the intent of basically like counterattacking or counterpunching the center to chip away at the control that white stakes claim to. So presumably in this case, the plan for black is to fianchetto the bishop and perhaps apply some sort of pressure on this location or in the center. So here is our first pivotal moment. We see that this move by black, which does look pretty natural, just developing the bishop with the intent to develop the knight and then castle, right? That looks like that should be a pretty non-controversial move, but this was a mistake for black. It gave white a big edge. So before I do my own analysis, if you want, take a pause. And here we go. So the very first thing that catches my eye is this tender spot on f7 looks very weak to me. So I want to throw a bishop at this, bait the king into taking it back, throw the knight here to check him, because if you throw it here, you just lose your knight. And from here, let's see if we can see one step further. Where does black go with his king? So the king's in check. Probably don't want to run him out here because you've got pawns and it'll be a lot easier to put the king in checkmate. So, and you probably don't want to keep him on this square because this queen is coming on the next move. So you tuck your king back and okay. That's a pretty cool situation. Check this out. Knight goes here, trapping the queen. So the king entombs the queen. Okay, there's a couple permutations there that are worth looking at. So watch this. So if the bishop takes, king takes, knight moves, and the king runs here, well, then you've got this move, forking the king and queen. So that's really not ideal either. So I think that's a pretty cool way to end it. But the takeaway for us is again emphasizing the f7 square in the case of black, or in the case of white, f2 equivalent. These are the focal points with your knight, or your bishop and your knight. All right, cool. Let's move on to our next game. And this one I also took a brief note of players involved. There is no ratings because this game took place in 1935. But the person playing white is Alekine. So that's pretty cool. And on the black side, it says four amateurs. So we have a one versus four setup here. So we're going to just move along until we get to a pivotal moment. Okay, so the very next move that we don't yet see is what gives white a big advantage. One thing I'm just observing before we get there is obviously white has some great central control at the moment. Black has honestly just developed a single piece. One piece has moved here. Otherwise, you just got a pawn that's moved. Whereas white has two pieces that have moved off the back rank and a pawn that's sitting in the center. So from a positional perspective, this looks considerably better for white right now. Okay, so black decides, which again, this looks like a very natural move. Develop your knight to f6. So this would be a moment to pause and question, why does this look bad for black? Okay, so at first, you probably are looking at recapturing or capturing, I should say, this knight, but because you got this, this pin pawn, but then the knight can just recapture, and you really haven't gained much by doing that. But another option is going the other way. So you're still taking advantage of the pin, but nobody can nobody can capture your knight on this square, and the king has literally nowhere to go, so it's immediately a checkmate. So that's a pretty interesting pattern. So both kings were still uncastled. So I'm just thinking about the pattern on this one. So king's still in the center of the board, but white managed to get their queen on a open file lined up with the king. So if that's attainable, then taking advantage of the pin is what really allows this to work. Okay. Now we are looking at game number 13, and we will step through some of the moves. So this is an interesting one right here because I think there might be a temptation to capture this to start hunting the knight. That might be a mistake though, because if the knight starts jumping around like this, trying to set up a situation where they can capture, then it tempts white to start making structurally poor decisions sometimes, like weakening their own king to try to chase the knight further, but there's still, some other safe options like going back here. Yes, technically the bishop could take it and you could weaken their pawn structure too, but I think from a principled perspective, it's best to try to maintain central control. Okay, white decides to take. Interesting. So black moves there, and what does white do? So white decides to ignore the fact that the knight's there, so that's another option. Interesting. Okay. So that move right here, I feel like was not necessarily great for white, because when you make a move, like I'm looking at how many defenders are of this pawn, right? There's three defenders, and one of them you literally want to recapture with because you're trying to develop this piece so that you can castle, right? So by white doing this, they're basically just giving a tempo away, because black can recapture with development. So that wasn't a great move by white. So this move right here is the move that pretty much starts the beginning of the end for white. So the question is, what's the move? So pause if you need to. I'm going to start thinking about this too. So in terms of lines of attack on the king, there's only one open diagonal. That does not look like that's used in this puzzle. I am looking at this type of idea. There's some discovered kind of thing going on here. So if you could maybe pull the king away or something, you could have a free queen. That's a pattern that, let's see. So if we did like that, forking the queen and the rook, question is, so let's try this. This king takes, bishop checks. So the king has to move, but they can't run backward. So they have to go, presumably they'd probably just maybe recapture with the pawn to keep the king tucked away. Then this queen could just capture the queen. Yeah, that sounds about right. There we go. So that's a pretty cool one. I don't actually see that very often. Interesting. Okay, next game. All right, so here we go. Game number 14. So we have what looks to be like a kind of a queen's gambit set up here. Nothing too controversial yet. Okay, so if I'm black, I need to decide where am I moving my knight to. Probably here, I suppose, but that does weaken their structure if they want to recapture. Let's see. So the very next move that white makes is a mistake. So let's take in what they do. That looks perfectly natural at first glance. So they're wanting to protect this pawn and perhaps try to avoid any sort of bishop pin, if this pawn weren't here, right? So another option, though, that looks a lot less complex would be something more like this to protect this pawn, or maybe even something more like this, uh, applying a little bit of pressure on the bishop. A third option would be go ahead, it does create the pin, but simply developing this pawn so that you can release your bishop, but in the meantime, it protects that. So those are a few different options, but white chose this one. So take a moment and see if you can figure this one out. Okay. So I'm looking at this knight has to play a role here, so I just want to analyze these two. So if let's take this one first. So if this happens, it just seems like you could recapture with that one. Don't see anything major going on there. What about this one? So we have a pin against the queen with this pawn. So this pawn can't recapture without losing their queen. And we get another situation where the king is basically checkmated because they're entombed. And the only way to fix that is to just recapture, right? So if knight checks, pawn captures, bishop takes, and at that point maybe either king takes or the knight captures. Either way, it's just a lost game. Okay, let's move on to our final game, number 15. So, at this stage in the game, we're just before a mistake is made, but initial observation is black has complete central control, and there's really nothing that white has accomplished other than developing a knight and, having a couple. We got a half open file and a full open file between black and white. So if I'm black, I'm going to be eyeballing probably this tender square right here. This looks, or this open file, like if black, was able to get the knight out and castle and move the rook, but that's too slow. So let's see, the next move made. Okay, so that is a mistake because why? Number one, if I'm going to develop this knight, I don't know why I wouldn't do it here, because the first problem with developing it to this square is you've trapped your bishop. And so the only way to now develop is either to move the knight again so that you can move the bishop out, or set up a g3 fianchetto situation. But that's also, two tempo to get it there, and then castle, right? So if you want to take a moment to pause right here, this is the moment to figure out how does black capitalize in this situation. So for me, what I'm looking at, I'm still looking at this square. This bishop's eyeballing it. And if I move my queen out, what can white do to prevent this? Normally, you might be able to get away with something like, put a knight out here to defend it, but there's a pawn already fending off that square. So what else can white do? Excuse my phone, folks. I should have muted it. What else can white do? I don't know that white can do anything else. Let's take a look at the analysis on this one just to double check, because it looks like it's checkmate in one unless I'm missing something very obvious. Let's see. Knight d4. I mean, yeah, I guess technically, or knight e4. So yeah, you have the kamikaze approaches here of if knight d4, you're just throwing pieces at it to try to slow the exact situation down. But I guess if the knight moves, then the queen can come out and try to help defend it. But you've basically lost a minor piece at a minimum for no compensation whatsoever. All right. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this series so far, as well as these latest set of 5 miniatures. If folks still want me to continue through this book, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I may start splitting my attention between this book and some other ones that are also waiting in the wings for some coverage. All right. Thank you.